January 3rd, 2026. Early morning. Most people were waking up to routine headlines, unaware that something irreversible had already happened. U.S. forces entered the territory of a sovereign nation. No declaration, no warning, no televised address beforehand. Just quiet movement, coordinated precision, and the removal of a sitting president from power. Hours later, the explanation arrived. Measured, reassuring, familiar. This was framed as a law enforcement action, a necessary response, a matter of national security. We were told it was about justice, stability, and protecting democracy from criminal influence. You read the headlines. You heard the talking points. And like most people, you kept scrolling. But that story doesn't survive close inspection. Because events like this don't happen in isolation. They don't appear overnight. And they are never about just one individual. What unfolded that morning wasn't about a single arrest or a single country. It was about a system so embedded in daily life that most people never notice it operating. A system that quietly decides the strength of your currency, the price of energy, and which nations rise or fall without a vote ever being cast. Nothing about this was accidental, and nothing about it was contained. What happened was the first visible fracture in a structure that has supported the global economy for decades without ever asking for public approval. The rules governing that structure were never written down, but everyone understood them. Stay inside the system, and stability follows. Step outside, and consequences appear slowly, then without warning. This moment mattered not because force was used, but because it revealed how order is enforced when obedience ends. And when enforcement becomes visible, the illusion doesn't survive. This was not the story you were told. You were told this was about crime, about drugs, about a president accused of corruption finally being brought to justice, that the operation was clean, necessary, and overdue. A government enforcing the law beyond its borders to protect its people. That explanation was delivered carefully, with familiar language and familiar faces. It sounded reasonable because it was designed to sound reasonable. It used words people have been trained to accept without question. National security, stability, democracy, justice. But when you slow it down, when you look at what actually happened rather than how it was described, the story stops lining up. Law enforcement does not arrive by military aircraft in the middle of the night. It does not require special operations forces. It does not bypass international courts, extradition treaties, and decades of diplomatic norms. And it does not trigger emergency meetings across the globe within hours. Those are not the tools of policing. Those are the tools of enforcement. What you were told focuses on the surface event. One man, one arrest, one charge sheet. What it avoids is the mechanism underneath, the pressure that built long before that night, the warnings that were ignored, the decisions that made confrontation inevitable. Because if this were truly about crime, there would be consistency, there would be rules applied evenly, there would be predictability. But the world doesn't work that way, and neither does power. Power responds to threats, not principles. And the real threat wasn't happening in a courtroom. It wasn't happening on the streets. It was happening quietly, in contracts, in trade settlements, in the currency used to price something the modern world cannot function without. That's where the official story starts to fracture. Because when you trace the pressure backward, when you follow the incentives instead of the press releases, a different motive begins to emerge. And that's where the story begins to break. Every time a barrel of oil changes hands anywhere in the world, something invisible moves with it. Not the tanker, not the pipelines. Something far quieter and far more powerful. For decades, oil has been the bloodstream of the global economy. It moves everything. Food production, transportation, manufacturing, electricity. Modern life doesn't function without it. But oil on its own is just a commodity. What gave it leverage was what it was tied to. The dollar, think of the dollar as oxygen in that bloodstream. You don't see it, but without it, the system collapses. Every country that needs oil must first acquire dollars. That means exporting goods, taking on debt, or selling assets just to get access to energy. The demand for oil creates demand for dollars, and the demand for dollars creates power. This wasn't an accident. It was engineered. When oil is priced exclusively in dollars, the dollar becomes unavoidable. Central banks must hold it. Governments must protect access to it. Entire economies must orbit around it. The currency stops being just money. It becomes infrastructure. And like all infrastructure, it only works if everyone agrees to use it. Most people never see this system. They only feel its effects. Stable prices, cheap imports, a currency that seems permanent, but permanence only exists as long as participation does. Here's the part few are told. This system has no exit ramp. There is no formal process to leave, no vote, no paperwork. Because the moment a country decides to trade oil outside this system, the oxygen stops flowing. And when oxygen is cut off, survival instincts take over. This system only works as long as no one leaves. Once oil was tied to the dollar, it stopped being just energy. It became leverage. Pricing oil in dollars did more than standardize trade. It quietly transformed energy into a financial weapon. Every country that needed oil now needed dollars first, and the country that controlled the dollar controlled access to the most important resource on Earth. This created a system of gravity. Money flowed toward the center, oil exporters collected dollars, and those dollars flowed back into U.S. assets, U.S. banks, U.S. debt. It looked like cooperation. It felt like stability. But underneath it was dependency. Because when one currency becomes mandatory, choice disappears. The brilliance of the system wasn't force. It was invisibility. No soldiers were needed, no threats were spoken out loud, the rules enforced themselves. If you needed energy, you played along. If you wanted stability, you stayed inside the system. And for decades, it worked. The dollar didn't just buy oil, it bought influence, it bought compliance, it bought time. Countries didn't have to like the arrangement, they just had to accept it. But every system built on obedience carries an unspoken warning. As long as you follow the rules, everything feels normal. The moment you don't, the rules reveal their teeth. At first, enforcement doesn't look like violence. It looks like pressure, it looks like concern, it looks like policies that sound technical and harmless to people on the outside. But the purpose is always the same. To remind everyone watching what happens when the system is challenged. Every system has rules. This one has consequences. Before it became a warning, Venezuela was a model participant. For most of the 20th century, it was exactly the kind of country the system rewarded. Rich in oil, politically cooperative, deeply integrated into global energy markets. Venezuela wasn't on the margins of the dollar system. It was near the center of it. By the 1,970 seconds, Venezuela was helping shape the oil market itself. As a founding member of OPEC, it wasn't resisting global structures, it was inside them, benefiting from them. Its state oil company supplied vast quantities of crude to U.S. refineries. Tankers moved steadily to Texas and Louisiana. Payments came back in dollars, reliable, predictable, safe. Those dollars didn't sit idle, they cycled. Venezuela used them to buy U.S. goods, U.S. equipment, U.S. weapons. It invested in U.S. debt. The loop closed neatly. Oil flowed out, dollars flowed back. Stability followed, and for a long time, that stability felt like prosperity. Infrastructure expanded. Living standards rose. Venezuela wasn't fighting the system. It was proof that the system worked, as long as you stayed in your lane. This is the part that matters. Venezuela didn't collapse because it was isolated or defiant from the beginning. It collapsed after decades of cooperation, after years of doing everything it was supposed to do, which is why what came next mattered so much. Because when a country that has played by the rules for generations suddenly decides to ask why those rules exist, it doesn't look like rebellion at first. It looks like curiosity, like independence, like a small adjustment. Then one man asked the wrong question. Hugo Chavez did not arrive as a villain, and he did not present himself as a savior. He arrived as a disruption. A former military officer with a sharp sense of symbolism, he looked at Venezuela's oil wealth and saw something different from his predecessors. Where others saw a stream of dollars, he saw dependency. Where others saw stability, he saw a quiet loss of control. And he asked a question that had been unasked for decades. Why should a country with some of the largest oil reserves on Earth be forced to sell its most valuable resource in a currency it does not control? It wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't even framed as a rejection. At first, it sounded almost reasonable. Why not diversify? Why not trade with other partners? Why not explore arrangements that didn't require running every transaction through the same financial system? But the system does not respond to tone, it responds to direction. Chavez began slowly. Small gestures, new laws, subtle shifts in ownership. He pushed to bring oil projects under greater national control. He spoke openly about sovereignty, about economic independence, about a world where countries could trade without permission. To his supporters, this sounded like dignity. To the system, it sounded like defiance. Because the danger wasn't that Venezuela would collapse, the danger was that it wouldn't. That it might prove a country could sit on massive energy reserves and still survive without total obedience to the dollar system. That idea could not be allowed to spread. From that point on, Chavez wasn't just a president making policy choices. He became a test case, a live experiment, What happens when someone pushes against an unspoken rule? And rules like this do not forgive defiance. Once the first line was crossed, everything that followed became easier to justify. What had started as an economic question was quietly reframed as something far more dangerous. Trading oil in other currencies was no longer described as diversification. It was described as destabilization, as a threat, as an attack on order itself. Language shifted before policy did. Words like sovereignty were replaced with words like risk. Independence became irresponsibility. And eventually, non-dollar trade was spoken about not as a choice, but as a provocation. This is how systems protect themselves. They don't argue the merits, they redefine the behavior. When a financial decision can be portrayed as a security threat, it stops being debated and starts being managed. From that moment on, Venezuela wasn't just experimenting with trade, it was undermining stability. It wasn't seeking alternatives. It was inviting chaos. The framing mattered because once a country is labeled a threat, almost any response can be justified as defense. This is where inevitability creeps in. Because the system does not tolerate examples, it tolerates compliance. The longer Venezuela continued down this path, the less room there was for compromise. Every non-dollar contract narrowed the exit. Every new trading partner hardened the narrative. And the people watching weren't just in Washington. Other countries were paying attention. Quietly, carefully, learning what language would be used against them if they ever made the same move. At this stage, nothing looked like war. There were no planes in the sky, no troops on the ground, just statements, pressure, warnings wrapped in concern. But once behavior is criminalized, outcomes stop being negotiable. From that moment on, the outcome was only a matter of time. Open conflict is rarely the first response, it is the last. Long before any soldier steps off a plane, a quieter campaign begins, one that leaves fewer images, fewer headlines, and far more plausible deniability. This is where pressure replaces dialogue, and instability is manufactured rather than announced. In Venezuela, the first attempts to reverse course didn't come with missiles. They came with meetings, with funding, with influence applied in careful, deniable ways. Political opposition was elevated. Media narratives hardened. The country was framed not as independent, but as failing. Not as sovereign, but as unstable. Then came the moment that removed all ambiguity. In 2002, Hugo Chavez was briefly removed from power. A coup attempt that moved quickly, collapsed just as fast, and was officially disowned by every major outside actor involved. Statements were issued, concerns were expressed, hands were washed in public, but the message had already been delivered. Chavez was returned to office within days, but something fundamental had changed. The warning had been issued. This is how far the system was willing to go, even before sanctions, even before open confrontation. If leadership could be removed once, it could be attempted again. When that didn't work, the methods adjusted. Pressure became more systematic. Financial channels tightened, international institutions became less cooperative, access to capital grew more difficult. Each step was justified individually. Together, they formed a pattern. This is how enforcement escalates, not all at once, not dramatically. It moves from influence to interference to isolation. Only when every other lever fails does force become visible. Violence is always the last chapter. Sanctions don't arrive with explosions, they arrive with paperwork. They are introduced as policy tools, framed as responsible measures designed to encourage reform. To people watching from the outside, they sound clean, legal, measured. But inside the country being targeted, they behave very differently. Sanctions don't just restrict governments. They clog arteries. Bank accounts freeze. Payment systems stop responding. Insurance disappears. Shipping companies suddenly find reasons not to dock. Equipment breaks and replacement parts never arrive. Not because they don't exist, but because they can no longer be paid for, insured, or legally shipped. An economy doesn't collapse all at once. It starves. Hospitals run out of supplies. Power grids fail more often. Food becomes harder to import. Inflation accelerates not because of mismanagement alone, but because money stops moving the way it used to. The ordinary mechanisms of daily life become unreliable. This is what economic suffocation looks like. No single action feels catastrophic. Each restriction can be defended on its own. Together, they dismantle a society's ability to function. And the cruelty of the system is that the pain spreads unevenly. Political elites find workarounds, assets move quietly, the real cost lands on civilians. On people with no control over currency policy or geopolitical alignment. From the outside, the collapse can be blamed on leadership, on corruption, on incompetence. From the inside, it feels like living in a room where the air is slowly being removed. By the time shortages are visible, the damage is already done. Collapse doesn't always arrive with bombs. By the time Nicolas Maduro stepped into power, the path was already laid out. There was a common belief that everything hinged on personality, that if the leadership changed, the pressure would ease, that the conflict was personal, emotional, fixable. But systems don't work that way. They don't reset because a name changes. Maduro did not invent a new direction. He inherited one. The same policies, the same alliances, the same decisions that had already placed Venezuela outside acceptable boundaries. The system wasn't reacting to who he was. It was responding to what the country had become. By then, retreat was no longer a simple option. Walking back meant more than policy adjustments. It meant surrendering control, reversing contracts, abandoning partners, and publicly admitting that independence had failed. That kind of reversal doesn't stabilize a nation. It delegitimizes it. So Venezuela stayed the course. Oil continued to be traded outside the dollar system wherever possible. Relationships with China and Russia deepened. Alternatives were explored not because they were perfect, but because the old doors were closed. Each step forward made reconciliation harder, not easier. From the outside, the narrative hardened. The country wasn't struggling because of pressure, it was struggling because of defiance. The distinction mattered because it justified everything that followed. At this stage, enforcement no longer needed new explanations. The labels were already in place, the economy was failing, the leadership was illegitimate, the threat was ongoing, and once a system reaches this point, it doesn't wait for change. It acts to restore order. By now, the system had made its decision. Once you step back far enough, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Venezuela was not unique. Its mistake wasn't corruption, or incompetence, or authoritarianism. Its mistake was deviation. And when you line its experience up against others, the rule reveals itself with unsettling clarity. Look at Iran. For decades, it has lived under some of the harshest sanctions on earth. The official reasons shift over time. Nuclear concerns, regional instability, human rights. But underneath all of it sits one constant. Iran sells its oil outside the dollar system. It accepts other currencies. It trades through alternative channels. And for that, it remains permanently unacceptable. Now, look at Russia. For years, friction existed, but escalation followed a very specific move, demanding payment for energy in rubles, building settlement systems that bypass the dollar, reducing exposure to U.S., controlled financial rails. Suddenly, sanctions intensified, reserves were frozen, access to payment networks was severed. Once again, the behavior preceded the punishment. Then there is Saudi Arabia, a country with no shortage of controversies, a country whose actions on paper violate many of the principles used to justify pressure elsewhere, and yet it remains protected, welcomed, defended. Why? Because it sells oil in dollars, because it recycles those dollars back into U.S. assets, because it stays inside the system. The contrast isn't subtle, it's structural. Sell oil in dollars, and your actions are tolerated. Sell oil outside the dollar, and suddenly everything you do becomes a problem. Your flaws become intolerable. Your sovereignty becomes a threat. Your leadership becomes a target. This is the pattern no one is allowed to say out loud, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. For a long time, there was no real alternative. Countries could talk about independence, but when it came time to trade, to settle contracts, to move real volumes of energy, the dollar was the only game in town. If you needed scale, stability, and infrastructure, you stayed inside the system. That's why pressure worked. There was nowhere else to go. Then China changed the equation. Not with speeches, not with threats, with roads, ports, pipelines, and contracts written differently. China didn't ask countries to overthrow anything. It offered something much simpler. Oil for infrastructure, energy for development, long-term deals that didn't require passing through New York or Washington first. This was the first credible exit. For countries under pressure, this mattered more than ideology. It meant access without permission. It meant selling oil without first needing dollars. It meant a parallel system forming quietly, piece by piece, outside the view of most people watching markets. Venezuela was a perfect candidate. Vast reserves, sanctions closing traditional doors, an economy desperate for investment. China stepped in not as a savior, but as a partner with leverage. Loans were structured differently. Repayments came in oil, not currency. Infrastructure was built in exchange for future supply. This wasn't symbolic, it was structural. For the first time, Venezuela wasn't just resisting the system. It was operating outside it, at scale. And that is when tolerance turned into concern. Because isolated defiance can be ignored. A working alternative cannot. This is where enforcement turns into panic. What finally forced the issue wasn't rhetoric. It wasn't speeches at international forums. It wasn't even years of quiet resistance. It was a deal. A large one, long-term, structural, the kind of agreement that doesn't just move oil but reshapes incentives for decades. Venezuela and China were no longer experimenting at the margins. They were locking in the future. Infrastructure upgrades, refineries, pipelines, ports. Financing measured not in months, but in generations. Oil shipments tied not to spot prices, but to strategic planning. And crucially, everything denominated outside the dollar. This wasn't diversification anymore, this was realignment. For the system, this crossed a line. Because oil deals can be unwound, contracts can be pressured, but infrastructure embeds behavior. Once pipelines are built to flow east instead of north, once financing is structured around non-dollar repayment, reversing course becomes nearly impossible. That's what made this different. The concern was no longer Venezuela. It was precedent. If the country with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth could secure long-term buyers, financing, and protection outside the dollar system, others would follow. Slowly at first, quietly. But inevitably, at that point the system faced a choice. Allow the example to stand, or erase it before it spreads. Waiting carried its own risk. Every year the deal matured, the leverage faded. The longer Venezuela operated successfully outside the system, the weaker enforcement became elsewhere. The cost of inaction was no longer abstract. It was existential. After this, restraint was no longer an option. The operation didn't come with spectacle. There was no build-up meant for public consumption. No countdown, no warning shots. It happened quickly, deliberately, and under the cover of legality. In the early hours of January 3rd, U.S. forces entered Venezuelan territory under the justification of enforcement, not war. The language mattered. This was not framed as an invasion. It was framed as an arrest, a technical distinction that changed everything on paper while changing nothing on the ground. A sitting president was taken into custody, not negotiated with, not escorted through international courts, removed. Within hours, the narrative was set. This was about justice, about accountability, about ending criminal behavior. The fact that military forces were used instead of courts was treated as an operational detail, not a contradiction. But symbols matter more than statements. A sovereign leader was extracted by foreign soldiers. That image traveled farther than any press release. It reached every capital, every central bank, every energy ministry watching quietly from a distance. This was not a message meant for Venezuela. It was a demonstration. It showed what happens when pressure fails, when sanctions don't force compliance, when alternatives become real instead of theoretical. It showed that the final guarantee of the system was not trust or agreement or shared values. It was force, and once force is revealed, it cannot be unseen. Because systems that rely on quiet obedience only remain stable as long as no one confirms what happens when obedience ends. The message wasn't sent to Venezuela. What followed mattered more than the operation itself. Markets reacted first, not with speeches or condemnations, but with price. Oil moved sharply, not because supply vanished overnight, but because uncertainty exploded. Risk was repriced in real time. Traders understood something governments wouldn't say publicly. If force was now part of the enforcement mechanism, then every producer outside the center had to reassess its exposure. Governments responded next. Carefully, formally, statements were drafted. Words like concern and stability appeared repeatedly, but behind closed doors, a different conversation was happening. One about vulnerability, about sequence, about who might be next. Currencies told their own story. The dollar didn't surge the way it had after past displays of power. In some cases, it slipped. Quietly. Because confidence behaves differently when fear replaces trust. Fear doesn't bind systems together. It pushes participants to look for exits. What was most striking wasn't outrage. It was calculation. Energy ministries reviewed contracts. Central banks reassessed reserves. Quiet calls were made to alternative partners. No announcements were necessary. The lesson had already landed. If compliance is enforced through removal, then dependence carries risk. This wasn't a rejection of the system. Not yet. It was something more subtle. A reevaluation. The beginning of hedging behavior at scale. Diversification not as policy, but as insurance. That shift doesn't make headlines. It doesn't trend. But it compounds. Slowly at first, then all at once. Fear spreads faster than any currency. If the goal was to stabilize the system, the outcome was the opposite. Because systems built on confidence cannot survive demonstrations of force forever. The moment enforcement becomes visible, participants stop believing in rules and start preparing for punishment. That shift changes behavior in ways no policy can reverse. History has seen this pattern before. Empires that rely on coercion to hold economic structures together may succeed briefly, but they accelerate the search for alternatives. Fear doesn't create loyalty. It creates urgency. And urgency creates innovation. By turning enforcement into spectacle, the system answered the wrong question. It showed that the dollar was still powerful, but it also showed why that power was dangerous to depend on. Countries don't abandon systems when they are comfortable. They abandon them when the cost of staying becomes harder to predict than the cost of leaving. What was meant to be a warning became a roadmap. Once the red line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. Every future negotiation is now shadowed by the knowledge of what happens when talks fail. That knowledge doesn't freeze behavior. It accelerates exit planning, quietly and deliberately. And here's the paradox. The more force is used to defend the system, the more evidence is provided that the system cannot defend itself economically anymore. The foundation shifts from utility to fear, from attraction to threat. Power enforced too loudly doesn't last. This is the part where the story stops being abstract. Because systems don't collapse in conference rooms. They collapse in everyday life, at the grocery store, at the gas pump, in retirement accounts that were built on assumptions that no longer hold. When a currency loses trust, it doesn't announce it, it leaks it. Purchasing power erodes quietly at first, prices rise unevenly, essentials move faster than wages, savings buy less each year, even when the numbers on paper look the same. If global trade begins to fracture along competing systems, costs don't stay contained, energy becomes more expensive, transport becomes less efficient, imports carry premiums that didn't exist before. Inflation stops being a policy problem and becomes a lived experience. This isn't about panic. It's about preparation. People assume these shifts happen slowly, over generations. But history shows otherwise. When confidence breaks, timelines compress. What was once unthinkable becomes normal in months, not decades. And here's the uncomfortable truth. By the time consequences feel obvious, positioning is already late. Systems reward those who see pressure before it becomes crisis. Nothing about this is theoretical anymore. The incentives are changing. The behavior is already shifting. The only question is how prepared you are to recognize it. This is already in motion. If you want to understand what comes next, not just in markets, but in policy and personal finances, stay with this channel. What's unfolding now doesn't end with Venezuela. It's only the first visible fracture in something much larger. And the cost of ignoring it will not be paid by governments. It will be paid by you. Before we end, one last thing needs to be said clearly. This wasn't a prediction. It wasn't a theory. And it wasn't a warning about something far away. What you've just seen unfold is how systems behave at the edge of their limits. When flexibility disappears, when persuasion fails, when enforcement replaces cooperation. That moment tells you more about the future than any press conference ever will. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does follow familiar rhythms. Confidence, pressure, force, fracture. The names change, the currencies change, the mechanism does not. Most people won't notice the shift until it shows up in their daily lives. Higher prices, fewer options, a sense that something fundamental no longer works the way it used to. By then, the decisions that mattered will already be behind us. You don't need to panic, but you do need to pay attention, because the next phase of this story won't be announced with headlines or speeches. It will unfold quietly, in policies, in markets, and in choices made far from public view. If you want to understand those moves before they affect you, if you want to see patterns instead of reacting to consequences, stay here. The story doesn't end with the petrodollar. This was only the moment everyone was finally forced to look at it.